You may have heard of the infamous Love Canal in your high school history class, but what was a Love Canal? And why is it considered one of the biggest environmental disasters in United States history? What caused this horrible event and what effect has it had on the U.S.? The Love Canal was named after a late 18th century entrepreneur, William T. Love, who wanted to create a canal connecting the two levels of the Niagara River. The area was originally planned to be a dream community and for a while experienced large amounts of growth and success. However, in 1920, Love's Canal was sold in a public auction to the city of Niagara Falls, which used the land as a landfill for chemical waste disposal, and the area began to rapidly decline. Later, the U.S. Army began burying waste from chemical warfare experiments. In 1942, the Niagara Falls area was further contaminated by the Hooker Chemical Company. The Hooker Chemical Company and Plastics Corporation acquired the property for private use in 1947 and buried 21,000 tons of toxic waste in the land during the next 5 years. In 1952, the land and waste was covered with dirt and clay. During that time, the Niagara population quickly expanded and the city became desperate for land. The city bought the Love Canal for $1, a deal to die for, literally. They then allowed homes, schools, and other public buildings to be built over the landfill. However, people soon started to feel the effects of the poisonous waste.
At the beginning, the dangers of chemical waste were mostly unknown. Instead of being alarmed by living next to a major chemical producer, the city's residents were delighted at the medical developments that the chemical industry was creating. However, the land soon began to leak poisonous and harmful liquids that had been triggered by a record amount of rainfall. Waste disposal drums began raising up through the grounds' backyards. Trees and lawns were turning black and dying. In one instance, an entire swimming pool had been raised from its foundation and was floating on a flood of chemicals. Puddles of poisonous substances began appearing all over the area, and many people reported having colored liquid in their basement. Consequently, people started to become sick. First investigated by the reporters David Pollack and David Russell, the Love Canal disaster was quickly pushed aside. That was until reporter Michael Brown resurrected the investigation. He began surveying local families and had surprising results. The residents had been experiencing birth defects and many growth anomalies, children being born with eye defects, deafness, and slight retardation. Some were even born with extra rows of teeth. On top of that, the residents of Love Canal had an increased risk of cancer. As for the growing abnormalities, enlarged feet, heads, hands, and legs became a noticeable problem. At this point, protests began. At the head of these protests was Karen Schroeder, a local mother whose daughter had multiple birth defects. Due to media exposure, news of the event soon spread across the nation and became known as a public health time bomb. Love Canal is responsible for exposing toxic waste as a nationwide issue and leading communities to more closely examine nearby companies' toxic dumping habit. On August 7th, President Jimmy Carter announced a federal state of emergency and called for the allocation of federal funds and ordered the Federal Disaster Assistance Agency to assist the city of Niagara Falls to remedy the Love Canal site. This was the first time in American history that emergency funds were used for a situation other than a natural disaster.
The disaster of Love Canal sent ripples through American society. All over America, communities began to protest the outrageous practices companies had adopted for waste disposal. This brought up the question, is it the state or the government's job to control and clean up the company's messes? Or should taxpayers pay for disasters across the states? This debate ranges all the way back to the beginning of the progressive movement with FDR and to Teddy Roosevelt, who had been trying to get the federal government involved in environmental preservation and cleanup. But how much government intervention is too much? And does the Constitution give the federal government the right to intervene in state affairs? In the case of Love Canal, the state of New York was not acting. It was up to Jimmy Carter to step in and rescue the citizens of Love Canal. The federal government bought the residents' houses and an evacuation was ordered of the area. In 1980, Congress passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, also known as CERCLA. Its purpose was to clean up the sites contaminated with hazardous chemicals, and it gives the federal government the power to do it. It authorized two forms of response: removal actions and remedial actions. Removal actions were typically short-term responses to deal with an emergency situation in a timely fashion. Remedial actions were long-term actions designed to reduce the risks and threat of hazardous substances before they became a critical emergency. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry was created and tasked with compelling companies to clean up the sites, or used the federally designated fund called Superfund to clean up the areas. Love Canal raised awareness for just how bad companies had been treating the environment, and was the catalyst that spurred the federal government to take action against pollution. In the last 15 years, there has been a gradual resettlement of the Love Canal site. In the early 1990s, some areas were declared safe to live in. They now make up a neighborhood known as Black Creek Village. The area was taken off the Superfund list in September 2004 after the announcement that certain cleanup goals had been reached. However, much of the canal remains sectioned off by a chain-link fence, which to any local passerby serves as a reminder of the incident.